There is a version of you that you do not know. Not because it is hidden in some mystical realm, but because you actively avoid it. The human mind is not a transparent system. It is layered, structured, defensive, adaptive, and one of its most remarkable capacities is concealment, not only from others, but from itself. This concealed layer is what psychologists have called the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is not demonic. It is not a separate entity living inside you. It is everything about you that your conscious identity refuses to integrate. Every trait you judged as unacceptable. Every impulse you learned to suppress. Every emotion you were punished for expressing. Every vulnerability you converted into strength. Every weakness you disguised as indifference. The shadow forms early. As children, we are dependent on approval for survival. If anger results in rejection, we suppress anger. If sadness results in dismissal, we suppress sadness. If assertiveness results in punishment, we suppress assertiveness. The mind learns quickly. Certain traits are safe. Certain traits are dangerous. The dangerous traits are not destroyed. They are buried. This burial is not accidental. It is protective. The child who suppresses anger becomes agreeable. The child who suppresses fear becomes hypercompetent. The child who suppresses need becomes independent. The child who suppresses insecurity becomes dominant. The shadow is not what you are. It is what you had to disown to be accepted. And yet, what is disowned does not disappear. It waits. Most people believe they know themselves. They can describe their personality, their values, their moral positions, their preferences. But this description is a narrative, a curated self. The conscious identity functions like a public relations department. It manages reputation internally and externally. It edits memory. It rationalizes behavior. It protects coherence. But beneath the curated narrative lies contradiction. You say you value honesty, yet you distort truth to avoid conflict. You say you value independence, yet you seek constant validation. You say you reject power, yet you subtly control those around you. You say you are compassionate, yet you secretly enjoy superiority. These contradictions are not hypocrisy. They are psychological compartmentalization. The conscious mind preserves a consistent identity. The unconscious contains the incompatible traits. The more rigid the identity, the larger the shadow. The ego depends on coherence. To maintain stability, it must believe, I am a good person. I am rational. I am justified. I am consistent. The shadow threatens this stability. If you acknowledge envy, you are not purely generous. If you acknowledge aggression, you are not purely kind. If you acknowledge insecurity, you are not purely confident. If you acknowledge resentment, you are not purely forgiving. So the mind chooses preservation over integration. It does not ask, is this true? It asks, is this safe? And safety wins. Suppression is not elimination. Suppression creates tension. What is buried seeks expression. If anger is suppressed, it emerges as passive aggression. If insecurity is suppressed, it emerges as arrogance. If fear is suppressed, it emerges as control. If sadness is suppressed, it emerges as emotional numbness. The shadow does not disappear. It reroutes. And because it operates unconsciously, its influence feels external. You believe, they make me angry. They are arrogant. They are manipulative. They are weak. Often, you are encountering what you have disowned within yourself. Not always, but often enough to matter. The stronger your moral identity, the stronger its opposite tends to be in shadow form. If you identify as deeply compassionate, examine your hidden contempt. If you identify as purely rational, examine your emotional avoidance. If you identify as spiritually awakened, examine your superiority. If you identify as a victim, examine your covert power. The mind creates balance. Whatever is exaggerated in consciousness is often compensated for in the unconscious. This is not a flaw. It is structural. The psyche seeks equilibrium. When one trait is inflated, its opposite becomes shadow. Many people misunderstand shadow work. They believe it means indulging dark impulses, or abandoning morality, or becoming destructive. It does not. Shadow integration means recognizing capacity. You are capable of anger. You are capable of cruelty. You are capable of manipulation. You are capable of envy. You are capable of deception. Acknowledging capacity does not make you dangerous. Denying it does. The most dangerous individuals are not those who admit aggression. They are those who believe they have none. Psychological maturity begins when you ask, what part of this reaction belongs to me? When someone triggers you, the question is not, how do I stop them? It is, what is this exposing? When someone embodies a trait you despise, the question is not, how are they wrong? It is, what does this mirror? The shadow is not discovered in silence. It is discovered in friction. Every intense emotional reaction is an opportunity. Resentment, jealousy, moral outrage, disgust, contempt. These emotions often illuminate buried material. Most people interpret them externally. Few interpret them internally. In Audiobook 13, we explored identity and self-deception. In Audiobook 14, we explored power and influence. Now we see the connection. The ego protects identity. Power amplifies the shadow. The unconscious drives both. Without awareness of the shadow, identity becomes rigid. Power becomes corrupting. Morality becomes performative. Relationships become projection fields. With awareness, identity becomes flexible. Power becomes restrained. Morality becomes embodied. Relationships become mirrors. This is not spiritual language. It is structural psychology. There is a reason most people avoid this work. It destabilizes self-image. You may discover, you are not as selfless as you believed. You are not as independent as you believed. You are not as rational as you believed. You are not as healed as you believed. But you may also discover, you are stronger than you believed. You are more capable than you allowed. You are more assertive than you expressed. You are more resilient than your narrative permitted. The shadow contains both darkness and unused strength. What you suppress is not only destructive potential. It is unused power. Before we move forward, ask yourself, what traits do I react to most intensely in others? What emotions do I avoid admitting? What part of my personality feels unacceptable? What do I secretly fear being exposed as? That is where we begin. Chapter 2, Projection, Why You See Yourself in Other People. You rarely meet people as they are. You meet them as you are. Projection is one of the most powerful and least recognized psychological mechanisms operating in daily life. It is not mystical. It is not poetic. It is structural. Projection occurs when the mind takes qualities it cannot consciously accept within itself and attributes them to someone else. It feels like perception, but it is interpretation shaped by suppression. The psyche maintains a self-image. I am kind. I am fair. I am rational. I am strong. I am not insecure. I am not manipulative. When evidence arises that contradicts this image, tension forms. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. The mind has two options. 1. Update the self-image. 2. Preserve the self-image by relocating the contradiction. Updating the self-image is destabilizing. Relocating the contradiction is easier. So the mind says, I am not jealous. They are competitive. I am not insecure. They are arrogant. I am not controlling. They are irresponsible. I am not angry. They are disrespectful. Projection preserves identity at the cost of accuracy. Projection does not feel like distortion. It feels like clarity. When you are projecting, you feel certain. You feel justified. You feel morally grounded. You feel perceptive. This conviction is what makes projection dangerous. The unconscious material is emotionally charged. When projected outward, it intensifies perception. If you have disowned aggression, you will perceive hostility everywhere. If you have disowned weakness, you will see fragility everywhere. If you have disowned envy, you will detect jealousy everywhere. If you have disowned deception, you will suspect manipulation everywhere. You are not seeing others clearly. You are scanning for your own buried traits. Projection often disguises itself as moral outrage. Consider this carefully. The individuals who are most aggressively condemning corruption may have an unexamined relationship with power. Those who denounce arrogance most loudly may struggle with suppressed superiority. Those who obsessively criticize others' authenticity may be performing a constructed identity themselves. This does not mean criticism is always projection. It means intensity is a clue. When reaction exceeds proportion, projection may be involved. The more emotionally reactive you are, the more likely unconscious material is active. Societies project. Groups project. Political movements project. When a culture refuses to acknowledge its own aggression, it creates an external enemy who embodies it. When a community suppresses internal conflict, it blames outsiders. When a group denies its own desire for dominance, it frames itself as purely defensive. Projection is not only individual. It is collective. History is filled with examples of groups destroying what they refuse to recognize within themselves. The enemy often carries the shadow. Romantic relationships are projection laboratories. In early attraction, we project ideal qualities onto the other person. They complete me. They understand me. They are everything I'm not. What is happening? We are seeing disowned traits reflected back. You fall in love not only with the person, but with the parts of yourself you have not integrated. Later, as familiarity replaces fantasy, projection reverses. The same partner becomes controlling, needy, cold, selfish. Often, those traits were present from the beginning. They were simply filtered through projection. Attraction and resentment can both be forms of projection. One idealizes. The other condemns. Both avoid integration. Projection creates blind spots. You cannot see clearly what you are defending against. For example, if you secretly fear incompetence, you will be hypersensitive to incompetence in others. If you secretly feel unworthy, you will interpret neutral behavior as rejection. If you suppress your need for control, you will constantly accuse others of being controlling. Projection distorts interpretation before conscious awareness even begins. By the time you feel anger, the distortion has already occurred. Triggers are not random. A trigger is not simply something that annoys you. It is something that activates suppressed material. Notice this pattern. Some behaviors bother you mildly. Others provoke disproportionate reaction. The disproportion is the clue. Ask, why does this particular trait provoke me more than others? Often, the answer lies within. The trigger points toward shadow content. Not always, but often enough to investigate. One of the most dangerous forms of projection is intellectual projection. You believe you are being rational. You believe you are analyzing objectively, but your analysis may be shaped by unexamined emotional investments. For example, you argue against someone's position not because it is flawed, but because it threatens your identity. You criticize someone's ambition not because it is harmful, but because it activates your suppressed envy. You dismiss someone's success not because it lacks merit, but because it confronts your insecurity. Projection hides beneath reasoning. You construct arguments to defend emotions you have not admitted. The shadow reveals itself in mirrors. Every person who provokes strong emotion is potentially a mirror. This does not mean you are exactly like them. It means they may be embodying something you have not accepted. There are 3 common shadow mirrors. 1. The person you intensely admire. 2. The person you intensely resent. 3. The person you cannot stop thinking about. All 3 may reflect disowned aspects. Admiration can reflect suppressed potential. Resentment can reflect denied traits. Obsession can reflect unresolved internal conflict. Projection threatens certainty. If you admit projection, you must admit fallibility. You must consider, maybe I am not purely right. Maybe my anger is partially internal. Maybe my judgment is incomplete. Maybe I have blind spots. For many people, this feels destabilizing. Certainty feels safer than introspection. So the mind prefers. They are the problem. It is simpler, but it prevents growth. Projection cannot be eliminated entirely, but it can be interrupted. The key question is, what if this reaction says something about me? Not in a self-blaming way, in a curious way. When you feel strong emotion towards someone, pause. Ask, what trait am I reacting to? Do I possess this trait in any form? Have I suppressed it? Am I defending against something internal? The goal is not self-accusation. It is integration. If you recognize aggression within yourself, you become less threatened by it in others. If you recognize insecurity within yourself, you become less reactive to arrogance. If you recognize envy within yourself, you become less hostile toward success. Projection loses power when acknowledged. Projection is not purely destructive. It reveals what needs integration. Without projection, you would not notice your blind spots. The people who irritate you most are often your teachers, not because they are right, but because they reveal what you have not examined. Projection is the shadow's voice. The traits you refuse to carry internally are redistributed externally. The more virtuous you believe yourself to be, the more aggressively you may project. The more spiritually superior you feel, the more shadow material may remain unintegrated. Awareness reduces projection. Denial amplifies it. Consider, who do you judge most harshly? What qualities provoke immediate emotional reaction? What traits do you insist you do not possess? Sit with those questions without defensiveness. Projection is not weakness. It is human. But without awareness, it shapes relationships, politics, identity, and power dynamics. Chapter 3: Trauma and the Survival Personality. No one develops in a vacuum. Before you had philosophy, before you had ideology, before you had carefully constructed beliefs, you had nervous system adaptation. Trauma does not always mean dramatic abuse. It can mean emotional unpredictability, chronic criticism, conditional affection, inconsistent caregiving, social humiliation, long-term instability, feeling unseen, feeling unsafe. Trauma is not defined by the event alone. It is defined by the nervous system's response. When an experience overwhelms your ability to process it safely, the mind adapts. And those adaptations become personality. As children, we do not choose freely. We adapt strategically. If love is inconsistent, we become hyper-attuned to others' moods. If affection is conditional, we become performers. If anger is punished, we become compliant. If vulnerability is mocked, we become emotionally armored. If chaos dominates, we become controlling. If neglect dominates, we become hyper-independent. These adaptations are intelligent. They protect us. But survival adaptations are not the same as authentic identity. Over time, the survival personality feels like who I am. But often, it is who I had to become. The 4 common survival patterns. While trauma manifests uniquely, certain patterns appear repeatedly. 1. The people pleaser. This person learned. Conflict equals danger. So they regulate others' emotions constantly. They apologize quickly. They avoid boundaries. They suppress anger. They feel responsible for others' happiness. They call it kindness. But often it is anxiety management. 2. The hyper-independent. This person learned. Dependence equals disappointment. So they detach from need. They pride themselves on self-sufficiency. They struggle to ask for help. They avoid emotional vulnerability. They interpret closeness as weakness. They call it strength. But often it is protective isolation. 3. The controller. This person learned. Unpredictability equals threat. So they manage outcomes obsessively. They micromanage. They dominate conversations. They fear uncertainty. They struggle with delegation. They call it competence. But often it is fear of chaos. 4. The performer. This person learned. Worth equals achievement. So they build identity around success. They overwork. They crave recognition. They fear failure intensely. They equate productivity with value. They call it ambition. But often it is fear of inadequacy. The survival pattern eventually fuses with ego. The people pleaser says, I'm just empathetic. The hyper-independent says, I'm just self-reliant. The controller says, I just like things done right. The performer says, I'm just driven. There is partial truth in each. But the root is protective. When someone challenges the pattern, the reaction is disproportionate. Why? Because they are not just challenging behavior. They are threatening survival identity. Attachment theory explains how early relational experiences shape adult relationships. If caregivers were inconsistent, anxious attachment may form. If caregivers were distant, avoidant attachment may form. If caregivers were chaotic, disorganized attachment may form. These are not character flaws. They are nervous system strategies. But if unexamined, they repeat. The anxious partner pursues reassurance. The avoidant partner withdraws. The disorganized partner oscillates unpredictably. Each believes they are reacting logically, but often they are reacting from unresolved survival imprint. Return to Audiobook 14 for a moment. Power, influence, control. Why do some people crave dominance? Sometimes it is not ambition. It is nervous system regulation. Control reduces uncertainty. Uncertainty triggers old threat pathways. Dominance creates temporary safety. Similarly, why do some people cling to authority figures? Because authority signals structure. Structure signals safety. Safety calms the nervous system. Trauma influences how we relate to power. Without awareness, we mistake regulation for ideology. Sometimes trauma creates rigid moral frameworks. If you experienced chaos, you may crave strict rules. If you experienced betrayal, you may value loyalty intensely. If you experienced injustice, you may develop extreme sensitivity to fairness. These values can be healthy, but when they become inflexible, they signal unresolved emotional charge. Rigidity often protects vulnerability. The psyche has a strange tendency. It recreates familiar pain, not because we enjoy suffering, but because the nervous system recognizes it. Familiar pain feels predictable. Predictability feels safer than unfamiliar stability. You may repeatedly enter relationships that confirm old patterns. You may choose environments that replicate early stress. You may sabotage healthy situations because calm feels unfamiliar. The mind seeks resolution, but without awareness, it seeks resolution through repetition. Earlier, we discussed the shadow as disowned traits. Trauma adds another dimension. Sometimes what you disown is not immoral. It is vulnerable. You may suppress neediness, fear, dependence, sadness, desire for reassurance. These are not dark traits. But if they were unsafe to express early, they were buried. And once buried, they operate unconsciously. You judge neediness in others. You resent emotional vulnerability. You feel irritated by dependence. Projection emerges from trauma imprint. When someone suggests you soften control, relax independence, or lower performance intensity, your nervous system may resist. Because those patterns once ensured survival. Letting them go feels dangerous. The ego says, "This is who I am." The nervous system says, "This is how we stayed safe." Growth requires retraining both. Self-deception often protects trauma identity. If you admit you are afraid, you must admit vulnerability. If you admit you are lonely, you must confront suppressed need. If you admit you are angry, you must face buried hurt. So the mind constructs alternate narratives. I just don't need people. I just have high standards. I just don't tolerate incompetence. I just prefer independence. The narrative preserves dignity, but it may conceal pain. The question is not, how do I eliminate my survival personality? It is, how do I recognize when it is running the system? Awareness creates flexibility. Instead of always controlling, you choose when to lead. Instead of always pleasing, you choose when to assert. Instead of always performing, you choose when to rest. Instead of always withdrawing, you choose when to connect. Choice replaces compulsion. Ask yourself, which survival pattern feels familiar? What behaviors feel automatic under stress? What do I fear would happen if I stopped acting this way? These answers point to early wiring. And understanding wiring reduces shame. You are not broken. You adapted. But adaptation is not destiny. Chapter 4. The Hidden Desire for Power. You likely do not think of yourself as power-driven. You may even believe you reject power. You criticize dominance. You condemn corruption. You distrust authority. But beneath nearly every personality structure lies a fundamental drive. The desire to reduce vulnerability. And reducing vulnerability often means increasing power. Not necessarily over others, but over uncertainty, over perception, over outcomes, over emotional exposure. Power, at its core, is control over influence. And the desire for control is deeply human. Revisit trauma. When early life felt unstable, unpredictable, or unsafe, the nervous system learned a lesson. Uncertainty equals danger. Power reduces uncertainty. If you control the environment, you reduce risk. If you dominate the conversation, you reduce exposure. If you shape perception, you reduce judgment. If you manage outcomes, you reduce chaos. Power becomes emotional regulation. It does not feel like domination. It feels like safety. The desire for power rarely announces itself honestly. It disguises itself as leadership, as righteousness, as just wanting things done properly, as protecting others, as standing up for what's right. Sometimes these motivations are genuine, but sometimes they are led. Underneath conviction can be fear. Underneath assertiveness can be insecurity. Underneath moral authority can be ego preservation. The ego does not say, "I want control." It says, "I care deeply." And often it does. But caring can coexist with control. This may be uncomfortable, but power does not always look dominant. It can look wounded. When someone adopts a permanent victim identity, they gain moral leverage. They cannot be criticized. They cannot be challenged. They cannot be held accountable easily. Victimhood can become psychological power, not because pain is fake, but because unexamined pain can become a shield. If your identity depends on being wronged, growth becomes threatening, because healing removes leverage. There is power in appearing knowledgeable, power in appearing certain, power in appearing morally superior, power in appearing enlightened. If you have ever felt a subtle satisfaction in being right, you have experienced psychological power. This is not inherently negative. But when identity fuses with intellectual dominance, discussion becomes competition. Listening decreases. Correction becomes threat. Debate becomes ego preservation. You are no longer seeking truth. You are seeking control of narrative. In relationships, power dynamics operate constantly. Who initiates contact? Who apologizes first? Who withholds affection? Who withdraws? Who sets emotional tone? Power is not always explicit. It can manifest as emotional distance, silence, sarcasm, withholding approval, strategic vulnerability. If someone fears abandonment, they may control closeness. If someone fears engulfment, they may control distance. Both are seeking power over emotional exposure. Earlier, we discussed projection. Many people condemn power in others while secretly craving it themselves. You may criticize arrogance while enjoying subtle dominance. You may reject hierarchy while competing for status. You may oppose control while manipulating perception. The shadow does not always contain cruelty. Sometimes it contains ambition you denied, assertiveness you suppressed, authority you were told was inappropriate. If you were punished for confidence as a child, you may disown leadership. Then resent those who lead. This is shadow power. The most dangerous power structures often emerge from those who believe themselves pure. If you believe you are morally superior, you justify extreme measures. If you believe you are spiritually awakened, you dismiss dissent. If you believe you are unquestionably right, you silence opposition. The ego's certainty amplifies power's corruption. Not because power itself is evil, but because unexamined ego distorts it. There is a difference between influence and domination. Healthy influence respects autonomy. Domination overrides it. Healthy leadership integrates feedback. Domination suppresses it. Healthy authority recognizes fallibility. Domination demands infallibility. The desire for control becomes destructive when it is unconscious. When it is conscious, it can be integrated. You can acknowledge, "I enjoy influence. I value leadership. I prefer direction. I fear chaos." Honesty reduces shadow distortion. Power often masks fear. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of inadequacy. Fear of abandonment. Fear of unpredictability. When you feel compelled to dominate, ask, what am I afraid of losing? When you feel the need to win every argument, ask, what does losing mean to me? When you feel uncomfortable without control, ask, what feels unsafe about uncertainty? These questions reveal shadow content. Many people unconsciously crave superiority, not necessarily wealth or fame, but psychological superiority, to be more aware, more intelligent, more evolved, more self-controlled. Even spiritual identity can become power. I have transcended ego. I understand what others don't. I see through the system. If these thoughts create separation rather than humility, power is active. Shadow power often hides inside virtue. The goal is not to eliminate power desire. It is to understand it. Power itself is neutral. It becomes corrupt when denied. If you admit your desire for influence, you can regulate it. If you deny it, it will express covertly. You may manipulate through guilt, withhold affection strategically, control through subtle dominance, weaponize vulnerability. Integration reduces covert behavior. Survival personalities often evolve into power patterns. The hyper-independent seeks power through detachment. The people-pleaser seeks power through emotional leverage. The controller seeks power through structure. The performer seeks power through achievement. All are attempts to regulate insecurity. When you recognize this, power becomes transparent. And transparency reduces harm. Ask yourself, where do I seek control most intensely? What situations make me feel powerless? Do I fear being insignificant? Do I fear being unseen? Do I fear being replaceable? Underneath these fears lies the desire for power, not to dominate the world, but to stabilize the self. Chapter 5, Defense Mechanisms, the Mind's Protective Lies. You are not as transparent to yourself as you think. Not because you are unintelligent, but because the mind is designed to protect identity before it protects truth. Defense mechanisms are not signs of weakness. They are signs of psychological intelligence. They evolved to preserve stability. But what preserves stability can also distort reality. A defense mechanism is an unconscious strategy the mind uses to reduce emotional discomfort. When something threatens your self-image, your nervous system activates. The mind responds automatically. It does not ask, what is true? It asks, what keeps me intact? Defense mechanisms answer that question quickly, often before awareness begins. Rationalization is perhaps the most common defense. You behave in a way that conflicts with your values. Instead of confronting the inconsistency, you explain it away. I was just tired. They pushed me. That's not what I meant. It's not a big deal. They would have done the same. The explanation feels reasonable, but the function is preservation. You are not seeking clarity. You are seeking coherence. The ego needs to remain a good person. So it edits the story. Denial is more direct. You simply reject evidence. I'm not angry. I'm not jealous. I don't care. That didn't hurt. Denial protects against overwhelming emotion. But suppressed emotion does not disappear. It reappears in behavior, irritability, passive aggression, withdrawal, compulsion. The feeling was not erased. It was relocated. Minimization is subtle. You acknowledge something happened, but reduce its impact. It wasn't that bad. Other people have it worse. It doesn't matter. Minimization often protects trauma. If pain is fully acknowledged, vulnerability surfaces. If vulnerability surfaces, identity destabilizes. So the mind shrinks the event, but the body remembers. This one is especially common among analytical individuals. You analyze your pain. You explain your trauma. You theorize about your emotions. You describe your attachment style. You reference psychological models. But you do not feel. Intellectualization replaces experience with abstraction. It creates distance. Distance reduces overwhelm. But it also prevents integration. You cannot think your way through emotional processing. Understanding is not the same as resolution. We discussed projection earlier. Now see it as a defense mechanism. If acknowledging your aggression feels unsafe, you perceive aggression externally. If acknowledging envy feels humiliating, you detect jealousy everywhere. Projection protects self-image, but it distorts perception. You fight shadows in others that belong to you. Reaction formation occurs when you behave in the opposite way of a suppressed impulse. If you feel hostility toward someone, you become excessively kind. If you feel insecurity, you exaggerate confidence. If you feel attraction that conflicts with identity, you become hypercritical. The behavior looks virtuous, but internally, tension exists. The mind overcorrects to avoid exposure. Self-gaslighting is common. You doubt your own perception. I'm overreacting. I'm imagining things. I shouldn't feel this way. I'm being dramatic. Sometimes self-correction is healthy, but chronic self-dismissal often originates in environments where your emotional reality was invalidated. You learned that your perception was unsafe, so you discredit yourself before anyone else can. This protects belonging, but erodes trust in your own experience. Defense mechanisms reduce short-term discomfort, but long-term, they accumulate distortion. You build identity on edited narratives. You misinterpret others. You repeat patterns unconsciously. You resist growth opportunities. Defenses harden personality. Flexibility decreases. Curiosity declines. Certainty increases. But certainty built on defense is fragile. You may believe, I've done the work. I understand myself. I'm self-aware. But self-awareness without defense examination is incomplete. The question is not, do I know my strengths? The question is, what am I still protecting? Protection signals unfinished integration. Dropping a defense feels dangerous. If you stop rationalizing, you may feel guilt. If you stop denying, you may feel grief. If you stop minimizing, you may feel anger. If you stop intellectualizing, you may feel vulnerability. Emotion returns. The ego fears overwhelm. But what was overwhelming as a child may be tolerable as an adult. The nervous system can be retrained, but only if allowed to experience safely. Defense mechanisms also protect power. If you admit insecurity, your dominance softens. If you admit fear, your control weakens. If you admit envy, your superiority dissolves. So you defend. Not because you are malicious, but because identity feels at stake. You cannot eliminate defense mechanisms completely. They are human, but you can recognize them. The moment you catch yourself rationalizing, pause. Instead of defending, ask, what am I protecting? Instead of minimizing, ask, what does this actually feel like? Instead of intellectualizing, ask, can I sit with the emotion without analyzing it? Awareness weakens automatic defense. Not instantly, but gradually. Ask yourself, which defense do I use most frequently? Do I rationalize? Do I deny? Do I intellectualize? Do I project? Do I minimize? There is no shame in having defenses. The shame lies in refusing to see them. And once you see them, something powerful begins to happen. You notice repetition, patterns, cycles, which leads us to the next layer. Because defense mechanisms protect something deeper. Self-sabotage. Chapter 6. Self-sabotage and repetition compulsion. There is a pattern in your life. Not random events. Not isolated incidents. A pattern. It may show up in relationships, in finances, in career decisions, in friendships, in emotional regulation. You may call it bad luck, or timing, or unfortunate coincidence. But psychology offers another explanation. Repetition compulsion. The unconscious drive to recreate familiar emotional environments, even painful ones. At first glance, repetition of pain seems irrational. Why would anyone recreate rejection? Why return to unstable partners? Why sabotage opportunity? Why withdraw when things improve? Because the nervous system prioritizes familiarity over comfort. Familiar pain feels predictable. Predictable feels safer than unfamiliar stability. Even if the familiar experience is negative, your mind prefers what it recognizes. When a painful experience is unresolved, the psyche attempts to complete it. This is not conscious. It is structural. If you experienced abandonment early, you may repeatedly choose emotionally distant partners. Not because you enjoy distance, but because the unconscious hopes, this time I will fix it. This time I will be chosen. This time it will end differently. You recreate the dynamic hoping for mastery, but without awareness, you recreate the wound. Self-sabotage often disguises itself as failure. You delay important tasks. You avoid opportunities. You create conflict in stable situations. You withdraw when intimacy increases. On the surface, it looks destructive, but internally, it feels protective. Success increases visibility. Visibility increases vulnerability. Vulnerability activates old fear. So you retreat. Not because you want to fail, but because success threatens identity stability. Sometimes when things improve, anxiety increases. You receive praise. You gain momentum. You experience closeness. Instead of relaxing, you feel tension. Your nervous system is not calibrated to safety. It is calibrated to stress. Calm feels unfamiliar. So you unconsciously restore chaos. You pick a fight. You procrastinate. You withdraw. You overwork. You return to baseline. The baseline is not comfort. It is familiarity. This is especially visible in relationships. You may say, I don't want drama, but feel uncomfortable with stability. You may say, I want someone emotionally available, but feel bored when they are. Why? Because emotional unpredictability mirrors early wiring. If love once required earning approval, you may mistrust unconditional affection. If chaos once equaled connection, calm may feel like distance. The body remembers, even when the mind claims otherwise. Repetition compulsion is not limited to relationships. It shows up in career cycles. You may repeatedly overcommit and burn out, underperform and feel inadequate, change directions at the point of breakthrough, sabotage long-term planning. If early life equated achievement with pressure, success may trigger stress. If early life equated visibility with criticism, promotion may activate fear. So you unconsciously limit expansion. You call it not ready. But it may be regulation. Identity stability is powerful. If you identify as the struggling one, the overlooked one, the misunderstood one, the independent one. Then success, recognition, or dependence threaten narrative coherence. You may unconsciously act to restore the story, because stories provide stability, even painful ones. There is a strange comfort in confirming your existing beliefs. If you believe, "I'm not good enough," and you fail, it confirms the narrative. Confirmation reduces uncertainty. Uncertainty requires revision. Revision destabilizes identity. So failure becomes strangely reassuring. Not pleasurable, but predictable. Self-sabotage rarely announces itself. It whispers, "I'll start tomorrow." "It's not the right time." "I need more preparation." "I don't feel motivated." These statements may be valid, but if they repeat at key growth moments, examine them. The mind protects equilibrium. Growth disrupts equilibrium. So resistance appears. Defense mechanisms fuel repetition. Rationalization explains missed opportunities. Denial ignores patterns. Projection blames others. Minimization shrinks the consequences. Each defense preserves identity. Each identity reinforces the cycle. Without awareness, repetition continues indefinitely. Repetition cannot be broken through force. It requires awareness and emotional tolerance. When you notice the pattern, do not judge it. Observe it. Ask, "What feels familiar about this situation? What early experience does this resemble? What fear activates when things improve? What belief am I protecting?" Awareness interrupts compulsion. Slowly, not instantly. Growth feels destabilizing, because it requires new wiring. New behavior feels foreign. Foreign feels unsafe. You may experience anxiety when doing something healthy. This is not proof you are wrong. It is proof you are expanding. The nervous system needs repetition to recalibrate. New patterns feel awkward before they feel natural. The goal is not to eliminate all repetition. The goal is to move from unconscious repetition to conscious choice. You may still choose similar partners, but now with awareness. You may still pursue ambition, but now without compulsive pressure. You may still protect yourself, but now without self-destruction. Compulsion becomes choice. Choice becomes freedom. Ask yourself, what pattern has repeated most in my life? What emotional state feels normal even if uncomfortable? Do I sabotage progress when it exceeds my self-image? What narrative does failure reinforce? These are not accusations. They are invitations. Because beneath repetition lies something deeper. The parts of you have not yet integrated. And integration is where we go next. Chapter 7. Integrating the shadow without becoming it. The shadow is not your enemy. It is your unacknowledged material. Aggression, envy, insecurity, neediness, desire for control, fear of irrelevance, jealousy, resentment, ambition, manipulation, weakness. When these are disowned, they operate unconsciously. When they are owned, they can be directed consciously. Integration is not indulgence. It is responsibility. Integration is not acting out your impulses. It is not saying, "This is just who I am." It is not justifying harmful behavior. It is not glorifying darkness. Integration means recognizing, "I am capable of this." Without shame, without denial, without romanticization. Most people fear their aggression, especially if they were raised to suppress anger. So aggression becomes shadow. But aggression is energy. It is boundary. It is assertion. It is protection. When suppressed, it turns into passive aggression, sarcasm, resentment, explosive outbursts. When integrated, it becomes clear communication, directness, self-protection, confidence. You do not remove aggression. You refine it. Envy is often moralized as ugly, so we deny it. I'm happy for them. I don't care about that. It's not important. But envy reveals desire. If someone's success irritates you, there is information there, not condemnation. Information. Envy tells you what you value but have not claimed. When denied, envy becomes bitterness. When integrated, envy becomes aspiration. If you deny insecurity, you overcompensate. You exaggerate confidence. You dominate conversation. You reject feedback. You dismiss others. Insecurity does not disappear when denied. It becomes arrogance. Owning insecurity softens you. It allows learning. It invites humility. It reduces defensiveness. Integration does not eliminate insecurity. It reduces its control. As discussed earlier, the desire for power is human. If you deny it, it leaks out covertly. You manipulate subtly. You withhold strategically. You posture intellectually. If you admit, I enjoy influence. I want impact. I like being respected. Then you can regulate it. Conscious ambition is healthier than denied dominance. Integration requires emotional responsibility. Instead of, you made me angry, you say, I felt anger. Instead of, you triggered me, you say, this activated something in me. Responsibility does not mean self-blame. It means ownership of internal processes. When you own your reactions, you regain agency. Without ownership, you remain reactive. Shadow work requires psychological courage. Because it disrupts self-image, you may discover you are not as purely kind as you thought. You are not as independent as you believed. You are not as rational as you claimed. You are not as detached as you presented. But clarity is not collapse. It is maturity. When you see your full range, you stop being surprised by yourself. And surprise often fuels shame. Shadow work requires psychological courage. Because it disrupts self-image, you may discover you are not as purely kind as you thought. You are not as independent as you believed. You are not as rational as you claimed. You are not as detached as you presented. But clarity is not collapse. It is maturity. When you see your full range, you stop being surprised by yourself. And surprise often fuels shame. Some resist integration because they fear. If I admit this darkness, I will become it. But denial does not prevent behavior. It makes it unconscious. Awareness increases control. You are less likely to act destructively when you recognize your capacity. It is what you deny that surprises you. Integration increases flexibility. You can be assertive without cruelty. Be ambitious without domination. Be vulnerable without collapse. Be confident without arrogance. Because you are not suppressing opposing traits. You are regulating them. Rigidity decreases. Adaptability increases. When you integrate your shadow, moral superiority weakens. You recognize your capacity for the same flaws you criticize. This produces humility. Humility is stabilizing. It reduces projection. It reduces judgment. It reduces polarization. You no longer need to condemn others to feel intact. True compassion emerges from integration, not from moral performance. When you recognize your own capacity for manipulation, you understand others more deeply. When you recognize your own insecurity, you soften toward others' defensiveness. Compassion rooted in integration is stable. It is not self-sacrifice. It is clarity with empathy. Integration is ongoing. It requires honest reflection, emotional tolerance, feedback acceptance, pattern recognition, behavioral correction. You will regress. You will defend again. You will project again. The goal is not perfection. It is awareness speed. The faster you notice, the less damage repetition creates. Ask yourself, what traits in others disturb me most? What desires do I feel ashamed of? Where do I overcompensate? Where do I defend intensely? These are entry points. Integration does not make you pure. It makes you whole. And wholeness prepares us for the final stage. Because integration is not the end. It is the foundation for psychological maturity. Chapter 8. Psychological Wholeness. Psychological wholeness is not becoming flawless. It is becoming integrated. It is the shift from fragmentation to coherence, from compulsion to choice, from reaction to awareness, from self-deception to clarity. Wholeness is not dramatic. It is stable. Wholeness does not mean you eliminate insecurity. It means insecurity no longer defines you. It does not mean you never feel envy. It means envy becomes information, not identity. It does not mean you never desire power. It means power is directed consciously. Wholeness is emotional ownership. You recognize your impulses. You regulate them. You respond intentionally. Many philosophies speak of ego death. But total ego elimination is neither realistic nor necessary. You need an ego to function. You need identity to navigate the world. The goal is not ego destruction. It is ego maturity. A mature ego accepts feedback without collapse, admits mistakes without shame spirals, holds convictions without rigidity, allows disagreement without hostility, maintains identity without superiority. Immature ego defends. Mature ego integrates. Fragmented individuals swing between extremes. Confidence and self-doubt. Control and chaos. Independence and desperation. Moral certainty and moral collapse. Wholeness reduces volatility. You become steady, not because you suppress emotion, but because you understand it. Emotions move through you. They do not define you. Earlier, we discussed identity as story. Wholeness does not erase your story. It loosens its grip. You are no longer trying to prove, I am strong. I am independent. I am superior. I am misunderstood. I am awakened. You simply act, without needing constant confirmation. Narrative becomes flexible. Identity becomes adaptive. When integrated, projection decreases. You no longer feel compelled to condemn traits you secretly fear. You recognize shared humanity. You can disagree without demonizing. You can critique without contempt. This does not make you passive. It makes you measured. Wholeness increases emotional tolerance. You can sit with discomfort longer. You can hear criticism without immediate defense. You can experience uncertainty without panic. You can feel vulnerability without collapse. Regulation becomes internal. You no longer require control of environment to feel safe. This is psychological freedom. Integrated individuals are autonomous, but not detached. They can depend on others without fear. They can be needed without resentment. They can assert boundaries without aggression. Autonomy is no longer armor. It is confidence. Because shadow is integrated, influence becomes clean. You can lead without dominating. You can persuade without coercing. You can express desire without controlling. You are transparent. Transparency reduces internal tension. When you no longer need to hide, energy stabilizes. Wholeness produces something subtle. Mental quiet. Not absence of thought, but absence of internal war. Less rationalization. Less self-argument. Less defensive rehearsal. Less imagined conflict. You think clearly because you are not defending constantly. Clarity replaces noise. Psychological wholeness includes humility. You know you are capable of error. You know you are capable of shadow. You remain vigilant, not paranoid, about your own distortions. Humility stabilizes growth. Without humility, ego reasserts dominance. Wholeness is not an endpoint. It is maintenance. You will still experience jealousy, fear, anger, insecurity, desire for control. The difference is speed of recognition. Instead of weeks of denial, it becomes minutes of awareness. You catch patterns earlier. You correct behavior faster. You repair relationships sooner. Growth becomes iterative. At the beginning of this audiobook, we discussed survival personality. Wholeness marks the shift from survival-driven behavior to conscious living. You are no longer reacting primarily from old wiring. You are choosing from present awareness. That does not erase your history. It transforms your relationship with it. Let us revisit the arc. You examined ego and identity. You confronted projection. You explored trauma wiring. You acknowledged desire for power. You analyzed defense mechanisms. You exposed self-sabotage. You integrated the shadow. Now, you stand in coherence. Not perfect, but conscious. Not pure, but whole. Ask yourself, what feels different now? Where do I see patterns more clearly? What defenses do I recognize more quickly? What desires can I admit honestly? Where am I still fragmenting? Wholeness is not a destination. It is a practice of ongoing self-examination without self-condemnation. And that is maturity. You are not your ego alone. You are not your trauma alone. You are not your shadow alone. You are the integrated system that can observe, regulate, and choose. And that choice, repeated daily, is psychological freedom.